And so this is going to be the theory and practice part of it. And then later on during the poster session from 4 to 4:30, over in the lobby of the Downey Planetarium, they're actually going to show you the practice of this. So, Thor?
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. So I'm from Sac State. My name is Thor, and this is basically what we study. So this is kind of one of those earlier unique problems you were talking about. And it is indeed a unique problem. There aren't many people who study this. Got started off a long time ago. This guy in Norway thought it'd be a really cool idea to build this like huge 7,000 turn, 500 pound coil gun, try and sell it. And it didn't really work out. It blew up on him. But in the end, we got a lot of really cool results. So what we're doing here is we're taking a solenoid, like anyone you've seen before. We're taking a ferromagnetic material, and we're passing a huge pulse of current straight to the solenoid in a very short period of time, creating an instant magnetic field. That magnetic field is then polarizing with other ferromagnetic objects, like two magnets attracting each other, come together. But the magnetic field is short-lived, so it dies, keeps going forward through. So, what does the field look like over time? So this is just a brief demo of what it looks like. It's MIT demo, what the field would look like over time. That's kind of nice, right? Yeah. So what's the problem? Okay. Well, it's just complicated. This is very, very difficult to try and model these things to begin with. And we don't necessarily have all the tools immediately to model with them. So it's not very easy for us at this point in juncture to model it. But we've done the best that we could. And we've had a lot of developments that have happened in the time since this model that we're presenting right now has been developed. There's a lot of accounting involved, because there's a lot of different places where the energy is traveling. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then we have material limitations, which is one of the biggest problems, because we're ultimately limited by how much our material can do any kind of useful work for us. How much magnetic field can our material accept? How good is the wire in reducing the amount of resistance, traveling and passing current? So an initial solution. Well, let's say if energy is conserved, let's just follow the trails of the electrons. Well, let's start with a consideration. Suppose that we wanted to determine the final and initial velocities of the projectile and look at the final and initial energies. So if we start and say, let's assume 100% efficiency and say that the energy in the inductor, which is the solenoid, is the same amount of energy that's stored in the capacitor, which is the same amount of energy that's stored in the moving projectile, then if we take a ratio of the inductor to the capacitor, the energy stored in both places, and set those both equal to the energy of the projectile as it were coming from the inductor itself and the energy of the projectile coming from the capacitor, to create this proportional sort of equation. Okay, well this is not exact. That's clearly obvious. But we move along and we break down the 1/2 mv squared, 1/2 mv squared, and separate it across. We get the energy, the velocity from the inductor, and the velocity from the energy on the capacitor. So this gives us a nice starting point. Okay, take the square roots, put it all together. Now what about this term? We want to get it into a form where we don't have to deal with any time-dependent variables. So, move along. Say, well, let's recall if V equals IZ, right? Z is an impedance, so sort of V equals IR. And we know that the voltage across the inductor is the same as the voltage across the capacitor. And this is a big, big assumption. This is a blinding assumption, right? But this part is partially true. Then we could say that the energy in the inductor, right, would just be the square root of L over C times V inductor over V cap C and over blah. These two things should clearly cancel out if this is true. That leaves us with this 1 over Z term. Okay, now we're going pretty well so far. So then what if we plug in L, right, the inductor? And we replace L specifically with this term for R. This is actually an experimental method. It turns out that you need your coil gun to be longer than your diameter by a factor of 2 in order to eliminate the possibility of fringing fields from the magnetic field at the edges of the solenoid to have any major effects on the linearity of the field. Right? And so as a result, we take that, we take the area, we reduce everything, and we get this nice form. Okay. Turns out, for all of our own purpose, but we can just try and apply a little bit of logic. Okay, well, we said earlier that we knew this is a blinding assumption, right? That the energy is 100% all the way across. But now we know that there actually is some resistance in the wires, right? And so because of that, we know that the energy stored in the capacitor bank will be greater than the energy stored in the inductor, which will be greater than the energy stored in the projectile itself, which leaves us with this nice term, which we've cleverly dubbed the Barrera-Beer efficiency. So that's sort of started my take on putting our name on things, but it's not. It might be, it might not be. But the energy in the capacitor, right, should be greater than this. Now note, if I flip this and put it over here, the Z term is on the bottom, which is very important. Because if resistance were 0, right, then you would have 100% efficiency. But we know that resistance will never be 0, so you'll never get that 100% efficiency transfer. Okay, well, now we found that, what about how velocity depends on some of those other factors, maybe the time-dependent factors, like the current or the magnetic field. So let's start again with the same basic assumptions. What the magnetic field is inside the solenoid, what the inductance of the solenoid is, cross-section area, blah, 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 blah. And then you come here and you say, okay, if I take 1/2 mv squared, set it equal to 1/2 li squared, energy stored in the inductor, and do some geometric manipulations there across, and get this nice term. Umax is equal to L over M, I inductor. Well, now that L, once I put a whole bunch of stuff in there, right, we note that this L gives us a nice form of turns, area, and length. But I can be rewritten from the term B, where we can just have BL, the magnetic length effectiveness of the coil gun, and the mu naught N. Right? So now we can rewrite this all in this nice one term. We can start pulling these terms into the square root and start canceling things out. So velocity is dependent on the strength of the magnetic field. That's what it could suggest. Then what about the acceleration? Right? So we said earlier that the magnetic field, right, the strength of the magnetic field kind of determines how big of a velocity we get. Then if we take the time derivative of the velocity, that should give us the acceleration. Which the only thing here that's time dependent, and this is actually slightly wrong, is that if we just take the time dependency of the velocity to be time dependent with the magnetic field, then this gradient of magnetic field across the inductor, how quickly we can magnetize our material, will determine how much acceleration and ultimately how much velocity we get out of our coil gun altogether. So the ideal scenario, as we stated earlier, was that let's consider 100% efficiency, right? So we take our solenoid, we have a 1800 microfarad, 500 volt capacitor bank, and we dump that into 1/2 mv squared, right, and 1/2 CV squared. We get 225 joules. So we go through and say, all right, okay, cool. Now we come down here and we say, all right, we're going to compare the energy in the capacitor bank to the energy in the projectile itself. We know we have 25 gram projectile. So what should our upper limit on our velocity? 100% efficiency is 134.164 meters per second. However, if we take small numbers of that, right, which is what we're looking for because we know we will never get 100% efficiency, and most modern coil guns that are done by hobbyists and even some professionals don't get much better than 2 to 3%, we can say, oh, this is kind of the range we're shooting for, right? So 1.34 meters per second, 6.7 meters per second, 13.4 meters per second. Well, if we take a look at our current and our dry fire and our solenoid at the, I believe this is at, what voltage was this? That we
Probably like 500 volts.
500 volts.
Maybe so.
So this is a MATLAB computation that we did, and Mr. Beard will tell you more about the actual measurement instrumentation. And so you can see that we're kind of close onto that same amount. So this is the 500 volts as well, and it's kind of close to this 225 joules. Obviously, it's different because of that resistance. And this is kind of, well, this is actually good, talking a little bit about the inductance of the coil gun, which is a slightly important issue to deal with. As the inductance of the coil gun increases, and so does the time constant in which the capacitor is discharged into it. So that draws out this current. And we know, we said earlier that we need a really big dB/dt. So that means we need a really big dI/dt. So we can't really get that kind of change in current really quickly if we have such a long drawn out pulse. This we'll talk about later. So some of the results that we've gotten so far as today is in the voltage versus velocity curves without our slits. This is measurements where we come without slits using a brass tube. We've acquired a velocity of 19.96 meters per second. I said earlier that 1% was 1.34 meters per second. 5% was a little bit higher, and the 10% was roughly around 13.4 meters per second. Of course, it's not exact, but it's still pretty good. Now what if we cut slits in order to prevent the eddy currents that are created as a result of a magnet moving through a pipe, right? Sort of a classic magnet moving through a pipe model. So if we cut those eddy current slits, now we don't have to deal with as many eddy current problems, and that's slowing us down. We get an increase by about 3 meters per second, which is fairly good. It's still not good enough. So what's really limiting us, ultimately, is this term, permeability. And what's really important to understand in this problem is that the permeability is not a constant. It is time dependent and position dependent because we have a transformer with a moving core. And as a result of that, the inductance changes over time. And that creates a problem. So ultimately, we can say that the relative efficiency change that we see between these two results is 9.32% increase up from our original results. So far we're doing some good things in the right direction, but we still have a lot of direction to go. So for the foundations for the future, so I said earlier that this model that we had developed is not really the best model, the brightest model, or the most accurate model, but it was a model that was as simple as we could make it and was the best to work for the considerations we had at the time. We didn't know about this gentleman, Dr. Bill Slade, who apparently actually has also built his own coil gun and constructed a similar model, except he has developed Lagrangian for describing the system, which is a total internal energy Lagrangian, which actually is very nice work. So our next stage and step is actually to do a computational simulation of Slade's work and compare with our simple model and to compare our experimentational results with his experimental results. Hopefully, we can get better, faster, and stronger. So that's the end of my presentation. I know, I've got a lot of shit.
Yeah,
Any questions?
very nice talk. So actually, again, in light of the time, though, maybe
Yeah.
we'll one question. Okay, I have a question. So, what else besides cutting slits would you do to improve efficiency?
The material itself also contains eddy currents in it because it's ferromagnetic material, and so you have coupled magnetic interactions between the coil itself and the projectile itself, which is also a magnet. So if you make a laminated projectile itself, or cut slits in the projectile in an effective way that cuts that current inside of it, that will also reduce some of the problems we get you over time. And pulse time. Yeah, he'll tell you more about how to really make it happen.
Okay, well, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.